Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la 6e session d'atelier de la série Boîte et outils en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordonnatrice de sciences humaines numériques à la Faculté des Arts de l'Université d'Ottawa. Good morning and welcome to the 6th season of DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of digital humanities in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Ottawa. Before we begin today, I would like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, unissant ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent à Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you for joining us today in person and virtually. We have a great audience online today for our final session of the fall semester. Today, we're welcoming a thesis student from Master of Information Studies program, Lina Harper. And before we introduce the speaker, I just want to let you know, or I guess give you a few instructions. So we'll hold questions until the end of the presentation. And for our virtual guests, please submit your questions in the Q&A, and I will be happy to moderate those at the end for Lina. And introduce Lina, we have a special guest. I invite my colleague, Stephanie Haustein, to the podium.
Thank you very much, Jada. Thank you very much for having us today. I have the honor of introducing today's speaker, Lina Harper. Where do digital humanities find data? How do they use data? In this DH Toolbox workshop, Lina Harper will share preliminary findings from her thesis about data and DH scholars. She'll introduce some of her methodology to show how interviews can be coded for thematic analysis and NVivo. Lina will also center her lived ADHD experience to reflect on the challenges and opportunities this brain difference brings to writing a thesis. Lina is an information science feminist and researcher taking up space in a very loud and complicated world. Lina holds a BA in communications with a specialization in sound production from Concordia University. She's also an alumna of the Women's Studies program at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. As a master thesis student in the Information Studies program at the University of Ottawa, she will soon publish her thesis about her research looking at the data reuse practices of digital humanities scholars. Lina's other academic and professional interests lie in library reference, data discovery and reuse, information design, heuristics, and podcast production. She currently works as a data curator at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and what I'm really proud of is a member of the Skullcom Lab. Please welcome to the DH Toolbox series, Lina Harper.
Thank you all for coming. You almost made me cry. Didn't expect that. So wonderful to be here and everybody online. Am I changing my own slides? You should be able to. Just like this? Okay. I really hate presentations, but I am going to do my best. So today we're going to talk about my thesis topic. I'm going to do a little bit of a literature scan, and not too much because that's boring in a presentation, and mostly talking about my methodology. I'm going to do a little bit of a demo of my NVivo workspace and talk about my early findings and give a little bit of a rundown of my different brain. So how did I get to my thesis topic? It was quite the challenge to decide to do a thesis. There's an option to do just the program at the School of Information Studies, and the more expensive and longer route is the one I chose. But it is really just, really rewarding in ways I can't really explain. And it's really just, inspired me to have belief in myself and to have confidence, and to see a project through that is so long-term that you like love and hate every second and every minute of the day is really nice. So 10 out of 10 recommend. Also 1 out of 10 don't recommend. So setting the scene of my thesis topic. So scholarship, as everyone knows, is more and more data-driven, and digital tools and the internet continue to evolve. So sound data practices among scholars is now essential for scientific discovery. And good data practices are actually becoming required to meet the goals of an open science model. And as the shift towards open science research and output grows, interest in data sharing and reuse is high. I'll be sharing my slides because I'm not citing who said these things, because for the interest of whatever. So this is Gregory et al. And before that was Tenopir et al. An increasing amount of funding agencies and research organizations, data repositories and publishers are actually asking for, and sometimes explicitly requiring, are asking for data to be shared as openly as possible, when possible. That's Bryony et al. And Gregory et al. Buttons. I'm not used to this computer. How do I? Yeah, it's not doing it.
Try maybe re-clicking the screen, like just the PowerPoint, just re-clicking the PowerPoint, and then maybe you'll have your controls again.
Okay, thank you. So this research thesis project centered on 2 research questions. How do digital humanists use, find, and reuse data? And what are the barriers and enablers to data reuse among digital humanists? So the challenges and the opportunities, basically. And potentially, I haven't decided yet because I'm really coming to the end of my thesis project, but I'm not, haven't arrived at my conclusions yet. So our Q3 is perhaps where this question can be answered. So looking at ways in which data access and data services can be improved, especially among librarians. That was kind of my impetus for posing this question. So let's define digital humanities. Some of you, most of you may know, but it's important to do a little bit of definition of data reuse and research data. And like I mentioned, cited before, the literature that I leaned heavily upon are Christine L. Borgman, Tenopir, and Alex Poole. So research data defies unilateral definitions. They've been referred to as first-class intellectual objects, scientific capital, and centerpieces of modern scientific discovery. Borgman offers its simplest definition. Research data are entities used as evidence of phenomena for the purposes of research or scholarship. Research data, whether physical or digital, underpin scientific research findings and form the basis of scientific findings and outputs through peer review, publication, and learning contexts. And what is DH? Digital humanities research combines humanities and social science research methodologies with computational techniques to allow processes such as data mining, text mining, data visualization, data modeling, data analytics, and text encoding. That's one definition. There are so many. I find it more useful to look at who are digital humanists. And Bethany Nowvisky would say that they could be scholars working across disciplines, archivists and librarians, guardians and interpreters of cultural heritage, technologists, developers, and specialists in method and form, researchers, administrators, students, and shapers and makers of all kind, which doesn't that warm your heart? It's my favorite definition that I've come across so far. What is data reuse for scholars? When I started my interviews, which I'll get into later, I realized that people had different conceptions of what that means. essentially, it means using data collected by others. And so why would you ever use data collected by others? So it was, it's often to answer research questions, to eventually publish academic research outcomes in peer-reviewed journals, to use in a teaching context with students to save time and effort. And there are other reasons, perhaps. So again, this is still in the literature realm. Christine Borgman talks a lot about data scholarship, and this is a good optic to look at the sort of topic that my thesis tries to unpack. And it is a component in the knowledge infrastructure. And that's also a beautiful term that Edwards et al., Borgman et al. Have come up with out in the United States. So it's a robust network. They are robust networks of people, artifacts, and institutions. So data scholarship is really informing that knowledge infrastructure in this day and age. So fortunately, the ease with which digital humanists curate data and collaborate is written into the discipline. The literature suggests that one of the biggest factors that support data reuse is collaboration. And again, Bethany Nowvisky says that collaboration has been said to be a hallmark of DH. So very interesting concept that I think is unique to this discipline. And projects where DH scholars have funding and time and capacity to curate data enables future data reuse. And that's Poole from 2017. And a really interesting environmental scan, literature scan. That most of the literature comes from the last 5 years, just because the field is evolving so fast and is so new, essentially. So some of the challenges in the literature are of data reuse and data scholarship within DH are, it's also a challenge. It's an opportunity, but it's a challenge to collaborate and communicate among the other scholars, but also with data repositories, et cetera. It's a challenge to do project management as a scholar. It's a challenge to find resources, and there are definitely some technological challenges. There's also just the sheer amount of data possible for study. And I'll return to the intro again. More and more science is data driven. And so that's just creating just more opportunities for study. So types of data that you might see in digital humanities could be physical objects and their sort of digitization of or representation. So for example, Indian coins or ticket stubs from a Shakespearean play in a local township in 15th century England. These are two real examples from the interviews that I conducted. And there's also, digitizing a great project called the Women's Writers Project, where they digitized and made machine readable full text archives of the London Times, just to look at women's writing and women's role in that time. So a bit about my methodology. My interviews were recorded, transcribed, and coded. This portion of my research took approximately 75 hours. I was thinking about this the other day, thinking, what am I going to say for how many hours it took me? Because we don't want to think about how many hours it takes, but that's a source of pride as well. I earned those hours. Once transcription was complete, interview data was analyzed through content analysis in order to identify patterns in responses. This type of analysis is useful in identifying themes that may offer rich narrative detail for research findings. And this is from Braun and Clark. Analysis of empirical results using an interview methodology can potentially yield richer results than other methods, as opposed to using surveys, for example, or focus groups to collect data. Once the transcribed interviews once I transcribed the interviews, they were coded and analyzed using a proprietary qualitative research software called NVivo, which I'll get into a little bit more later. The population under study was digital humanists. The sample ended up being 12. I had aimed for, I think my original research ethics board submission was like 25. So that was a little bit ambitious, but 12 was just perfect for a thesis. I don't think that anybody expects more from at that level. The participants were drawn from 3 years of ADHO conferences, conference material between 2018 and 2020. This information is found on their websites. They archive a really good list and keep it updated for many years now. These events have been running since 2006 under its current name, but began under another name in 1989. So it's one of the longest running international DH conferences. And it is considered to be one of the core gatherings in the field of DH. And then the locations that, because I chose those 3 years, those locations ended up being Mexico, Utrecht, and Ottawa. So like I said, this website, the ADHO website, preserves a reliable archive of conference papers. It's the longest running. And for many DH scholars, it is, quote, the one event in the academic calendar at which their DH research can be appreciated in all its interdisciplinary glory. That's Laura Estel et al. So from the final list of scholars that I collected in my data set, so names from those papers, I selected a first batch of scholars, and they were contacted by email. This information is available on the internet. It was rare that they weren't findable on the internet in this day and age. It's very rare, but I did have to eliminate 2 people based on the fact that they were not really findable. So I figured if you're an academic or a scholar, you should have, you tend to have you're a public figure, and you should you have your own consent to put your name out there. And so I didn't want to pry too much into people who want to live private lives. The ADHO conference, by the way, and digital humanities attracts not just scholars, right? It's practitioners, it's makers, technologists, like I mentioned before, librarians. So people whose job isn't mainly to be an academic. So with that in mind, I contacted people through email, through a recruitment email that I vetted through the Research Ethics Board, of course. And then I had a rule: if no response was received within 2 to 4 business days, I would send a second email just to ask if they had really received my email and were they truly not interested, just to give them a chance to respond, but also not to be too much of a pest. Sometimes I got no answers, I'll be very honest, and that's fine. Sometimes the second email, they would be like, yes, I got your first email, I'm really not interested, I'm too busy. It was often, I'm too busy, if they said no. And then, once they decided to disqualify themselves from my research, I would move on to the next batch of 10 names. Because I also didn't want to get too many participants and then have to, say, I'm sorry, actually, no, or make the study much bigger and unwieldy and unmanageable. This recruitment email also asked the participants or potential participants to screen themselves in. I wanted to make sure I was talking to people that themselves identified as digital humanists. So that was one way to screen themselves in. I also asked this question. The very first question in my interview was, do you do digital humanities? At first it was, are you a digital do you work in digital humanities? And I kind of, as you go along the interviews, you kind of perfect the way you ask questions. And so it ended up being, do you do digital humanities? Because that was the one that was got more responses. So like I said, the, so, right. So this is my, I don't know if everybody can see, it's kind of small. My method of analysis was the interview, and me and Stephanie, my thesis supervisor, got together and took a really long time to brainstorm blocks of questions and figure out really what we were looking for. And I think this was really valuable time spent. And I separated them into blocks. So the first block is data use and reuse in research. Although my thesis is about data reuse, the more I got into the research, the more I realized that it begs the question of how do people actually use data, not just reuse, right? And that was kind of like the thing that I needed to know to set up the rest of the study. This first block of question was by far the longest one in terms of responses by participants, just because scholars are very complicated people with complicated research, and they love talking about what they're working on. And so it was a pleasure to listen to them, but I knew that was gonna take a long time, so that's at the beginning. There's questions too in here, like there's a question number 5, describe your main research methods, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. Stephanie and I both thought that that was going to be a very clear cut, like I just do quantitative, but often it was no, I just, whatever the data demands of me is how I'll get there is the secondary to my question. And you know, in humanities, some of the participants were in very traditional humanities like history or literary criticism. And so you would think that it would be qualitative, or I thought, but it often wasn't. It was often quantitative, actually. The second block was research data management. This actually didn't really pan out as well. I'm not sure I would ask this block of question again. There was less interest in this, I think, because research data management is very talked about in policy circles and funders these days. And so because it's like a requirement, people are very, it's like PTSD, I think, when they hear that. And a lot of times participants thought they were experts themselves already in managing their data. If that's the one thing that I took out of that block of question, I think that's very valuable information. And how we can reach people with research data management is understanding that they themselves are experts, I think is really useful information. And then I had a section about data sharing and reuse. My thinking around data sharing and reuse at the beginning was on a slippery slope. I would often think of data sharing and reuse in the same way, in a way, like I couldn't quite make the difference in my brain. But, you know, the way I see it now is that data sharing is the thing that comes before data reuse. But they work really well together. They have to exist together. Excuse me for my repetitive, that is. Okay, so now I'm gonna play this video, which my tech support friend will help me with. Show you a little bit of how I use NVivo. So there are other qualitative research software that you can use. MaxQ something is another one. This one is free. NVivo is free if you go to University of Ottawa. So that's nice. The one thing I'll say, and then I'm done slamming NVivo, because it's done a lot for me and it's great. But something that I find difficult is that it's computer-based, not cloud-based. So whatever machine you have it installed on is the one you're stuck in. And I have a desktop, and sometimes I like to study at the library. So it made things kind of complicated for me. I was often stuck at home in the summer coding in NVivo. It was one of the saddest. No, it was a great summer. So where do they find data to reuse? So I found out that, wait, am I already at findings? Okay. Yeah, I guess I am. That's, yeah. So, and I'll be happy to answer any like methodology questions or anything else from what I've spoke about later. But so on to my early findings, I'm very close to like clinching the findings section, and I've started populating the conclusions discussion section. But I'm not quite there. But so some of the interesting things I wanted to kind of bring out for you today are these sort of initial findings. So searching for data seems to be very unique, and it's, you know, based on that individual heuristic way that everybody has. So that's very hard to teach around if you're a librarian, for example, or designing a repository, a data repository, for example, because they ran the gamut, right? Where they found it and how they found it, data, it was A to Z, honestly. So each scholar began with an idea they wanted to research, and they searched the internet, like we all do, for a data set they might that might answer their research question. And often this was done in sort of the exploratory phase of their research. And it's interesting in a way, because if they didn't find what initially, like almost immediately or with ease, what the sort of in the vein of what they wanted to study, they would let go of that idea and move on, right? So again, possibly some recommendations for repository designers there. Data corpora could include collections by an institution such as a museum, government, or it could be sourced from a third party who has it stored on the internet. And the places that came up a lot were Kaggle, GitHub, or sometimes scraping the web. There were 6 out of 12 of my scholars, so 50% had scraped the web. Very interesting finding, because what are the other 50% doing? Do they know how? Do they know that's a possibility? Again, tying it in with the training needed to reuse data. And open API sources tend to be like Wikipedia and archives.org. There's a lot more than just those ones. Some of the ones that were mentioned by my interview participants are GitHub, Kaggle.com, academic library databases and repositories, Wikipedia, Wikidata, parliamentary proceedings archives. That came up a lot in, you know, a lot of the countries that I interviewed for. That was across the board. People really liked parliamentary proceedings. The Dutch Library Rijksmuseum came up more than, I think, 3 times, which was a surprise. The British Library as well came up many times. There was a lot of Europeans in my study then again, so I don't know, but interesting finding. IMDb came up, reddit.com, Google, goodreads.com, bookstores, physical bookstores, public discussion forums online, and the Library of Congress. So this, I don't know if it's big enough for people to see. It's not quite big in mine, but I guess you could see, yeah. So this is a table that I created, and it fought me. It really fought me. Like sometimes doing a thesis is hard, but like sometimes it's just like margins in Word that kill you. So this is, what is this? What kind of data do they use? This is the kind of, right, so the data types are in the middle column, and then their field of study is in also the middle column, and then the participant IDs, which I have another table that's private to me where I have the names of my participants so that I remember who number one is, etc. But I'm not going to be publishing that, so it's like kind of mental gymnastics to keep those straight. But yeah, those are very interesting fields of study, you know, and they were taken from a random sample. So, you know, it's very representative, I think, of the field of digital humanities. So really happy with that, including there's two sort of librarian type people. So just a really good cross section of people. The final column I found was really interesting. And like when you're analyzing your data, when you're analyzing your interview transcripts, you have to let the data speak to you in a way, right? So it's hard to, sometimes it's human nature to want to say like, this is what I think I'll find and whatever, right? But so I let the data speak to me, and this came up quite a bit, which is that a lot of these scholars were professors and they needed to find data sets for teaching purposes. And I think there's something there. I mean, the fact that they said yes to being interviewed by a master's student speaks to some kind of pedagogy in their value system, and also that collaboration thing that I spoke of earlier. Next, participant demographics. Yeah, so this is also de-identified as much as possible, just to show where people are coming from. And it's, again, a really good representation of the types of researcher or digital humanist, really, that came across my in my world. And so career stage were mid, late, and early. I wasn't really sure, like some of them are postdoctoral candidates. So at first I kind of just said they were postdocs, but I've decided to call them early researchers because what they're doing counts definitely as research, and they're kind of like headed towards being researchers for life, right? Because it's costs so much money to do a PhD and etc. So you might as well keep going once you're there, right? What I really like too is that there was some heritage organizations or research organizations, not just purely academics. So yeah, I really like that cross section. So more about my themes. So I organized my themes into according to my research question. My research question, to remind you, were more or less, what kind of data do DH researchers use and reuse? And question two was, what are their challenges? What are their opportunities? What are the enabling factors? What are the barriers? And so I had to organize the findings. The challenge section had to be organized into structural and non-structural barriers because there was a lot of challenges. There's a good amount of opportunities and enabling factors that I found, but I thought it was helpful to subdivide these results into structural and non-structural barriers, because I think structural barriers are things that are a little bit harder to overcome and are part of the infrastructure, and they're, you know, as I explained here, they're institutional, professional, public structure related. But the non-structural barriers are a little bit easier to shift, maybe, because they have to do with human beings, and human beings have shifting feelings and sentiments and perceptions. So those structural challenges, like by and large, biggest one, no surprise, lack of resources, time, money, and limited support from other research support staff and graduate students. Not the time and money, but like they're all separate categories. But basically lack of time and lack of money, huge barrier. Often there was anecdotes like, I had this great grad student who scraped the web for us for this particular research question, and then they left. Or we ran out of funding and we couldn't pay them anymore. So The other big one was poor access to clean, curated, usable, and open data. What does that mean? That means the data is very dirty. And then there's a lack of technical skills, and there's a need to train people on how to open different file formats, or exploit the data or wrangle the data and the software and tools that correspond to those things. So this is a quote from Dr. George having to do with poor access to clean data. And so I think that, quite a bit of work needs to be done up front, or you need to have tools that are able to handle sort of these discrepancies within data, and they're almost always going to exist. I mean, it's rare to find a data set that's perfectly curated. It took like 6 months just for this one particular data set. Without a postdoc who's sort of dedicated to this issue, people just don't have the time to do that kind of clean. This is a quote from Dr. Connor about lack of resources. What if there are other organizations, data organizations like libraries and archives collecting similar data sets? It might be that these data need further processing by researchers. It's difficult to predict the needs of researchers for these organizations. You really can't tell before you start doing the research what you might actually need from the data. Dr. Hannah, gathering the corpora is the most time-consuming part of every study that we do. Gathering the data on our own for each project would be simply impossible. So again, non-structural, human factors, attitudes, motivations, processes, habits, that can be barriers to data reuse. And they seem to be tied to sentiment and attitudes and perceptions, such as, I coded them as, I'm not saying this is correct, but you make choices when you're creating a research project. So I subdivided my codes for that section into labor intensity, responsibility of data management, inconsistent data sharing practices, and difficulty in accessing the data, as well as the diverse and wide-ranging data types that exist. So an example of the labor intensity is from Dr. Jen. Researchers have a lot on their plate, and this is just another thing to add, right? So it's hard to find a way in time. From Dr. Allen, that took an awful lot of manual work. We had like 5 people looking at that for a weekend, basically. From Dr. Lina, sometimes we scrape data depending on how hard it is to use the API or if it's not available in any other way. So the opportunities now, I mentioned earlier on how collaboration is a hallmark of DH. This was by and large something that came through often. Often they would mention things like TEI, text encoding initiative, and how that has been created by and is for digital humanists and continues to be worked on voluntarily by the community. And it's just a way to make text machine readable, just to be very, to boil things down. That's what TEI more or less is. But there's all these rules and stylistic rules and things like that. But, that to me, the fact that TEI exists in DH is really like a nice nugget of collaboration that just shows how collaborative this community is. A really surprising, awesome finding was that data reuse leads to more data reuse and richer data, right? So if somebody was using a data set, they would actually augment it, or they might find a data set that they thought was really useful, but was missing certain years. And then they might find somehow other years and make a huge data set. So they've actually now augmented the initial piecemeal data set that they found. And so another question that I would sometimes ask, or sometimes it would come up is, and I think this is just more of a needs further study kind of thing, is like, if you now have augmented the data and you've now created a bigger beast of a data set, are you now the author of that data set, right? You've derived from, you've sourced from, but is it now yours? And so that IP piece, the intellectual property piece, I think is a really exciting future avenue for, it's a whole nother thesis. The other one that I really, really love is that digital humanists are, are self-taught. If you could argue that a lot of academics maybe are, I don't know, but they will find a way to kind of teach themselves what they need to know. And it's even more so if you're dealing with a lot of data in your work. There's all sorts of file formats out there, and there's also really cool tools that people create for free to wrangle the data, like OpenRefine, for example, that are free to use. And then the other one too, very interesting, didn't expect to find this. These scholars are enablers of data reuse themselves. And in fact, sometimes they are creating data for their future selves. So there was one in particular who did some Greek literary text analysis. And the whole point of creating this wiki site was to have a place to store all these texts and the associated annotations and the translations in order for them to go back in 20 years and themselves reuse the data. I didn't expect that at all, so very cool finding. A quote from Dr. Allen about collaboration. Yeah, so I think a lot of the actual work is really about finding, curating, reusing data sets and figuring out like what are the affordances of this data set? Like, that's kind of how I started thinking about it. Like, what can I do with it? What are the handles on it? How heavy is it? How heavy is it? And I'd be interested in if anybody has any questions. The conclusion I'm still working on, the discussion piece, but these are sort of the things that I'm working on right now for that section is this recommendation that curating data optimizes data reuse. I'm a data curator for my full-time job, so this is maybe biased thinking, I don't know, but I do believe that that is a key to this puzzle. And policymakers have to closely watch how disciplines use and reuse data. And I think there are differences among the disciplines, definitely. And there is this quote that there's this diagram from Brian Nosek that I want to show. And if data reuse is required as part of a funding agreement, and in Canada, data deposit is becoming a requirement in order to receive funding, that doesn't mean data reuse, but it's in that realm. So, and it makes people very nervous, right? Because there's some privacy issues and there's some hoarding of data, or people don't want to be scooped, things like that. So sharing data is very tenuous right now. But one way out of it is to make it rewarding, make it normative, make it required, make it possible. And you see this cute diagram. Improving the ease with which scholars reuse data requires culture change. Culture change in academia requires coordinated policy, rewards, and incentives, and changes at the community level to make data reuse a normative practice. Those with a vested interest to improve all aspects of the open data landscape, open science landscape, would do well to frequently and persistently put efforts towards improving the experience of scholars' reuse of data, DH and beyond. That's the end of that part. And I'll wrap things up really soon, but this is like my personal therapy session now. So I said at the beginning, hello, I'm Lina, and that was my academic presentation. But this is part 2. Hello, I'm Lina, and I have attention deficit disorder. It's not something that people talk about a lot. It's been in the past talked about with shame, and I think that I'm very anti-shame, and I think that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So It just means that you have a different brain and everybody's struggling with something. I don't really struggle, I would say. I live my life like everybody here does. Everybody has something that they walk through. And yeah, even though our brains are a bit different, we can still, and I can still do complex thinking, even complete a big old thesis. And so of course there's a meme or two. I'll let you read it because it's lame to read a meme. How to have a conversation. Who hasn't gone through this? Get really excited and talk about the topic, freak them out. Okay, so now I have these two diagrams. It's the iceberg of ADHD. This is a little bit of a sort of what's not going great with ADHD. And the little pink circles are the ones I've identified that I had problems with during my academic career. Trouble focusing is a huge one. Poor sense of time, financial problems. I mean, I paid for my education. That just says it all, right? Executive dysfunction, other things. Choice paralysis, huge one for me. So that's kind of like the reality. It's just kind of like what I walked through in life. But there's this other one. It's the strength iceberg. And there's so many cool things about overcoming what you have to overcome in life. And something that I'm really good at is finding creative solutions. I love to learn. I have a lot of imagination. I can hyper focus. Very good for deadlines, like when you have to do a presentation at 11:30 and you're still doing your presentation at 11. And sense of humor. Oh yeah, I didn't time that, but that was good. Risk taking. Risk taking, being here is a risk to my life. No, problem solving. And yeah, I think that's it. Happy to have a conversation or answer questions. My email is there. I want to give a big thank you to Stephanie Haustein, but also Jada Watson. Not just for today, actually, I'm talking about in my thesis. Mary Kavanaugh, Constance Cronton, Helen Carrier, Leanne, Anton, Kathleen, Mario, people that I reached out to many times and have been there for me. And I really just think collaborating is also part of, information science here at U Ottawa. So thank you for that. And thank you for coming.
Well, now that we're all crying, thank you, Lina. Thank you so much for the great presentation and preliminary dive into your results, or dive into your preliminary results. We have two questions that have joined us that have been sent us virtually, so I'll read them out for you.
Okay.
Actually, I'll stand up to the side and you can answer them. So the first one, thanks for sharing how you coded your research materials. You alluded to using certain codes. Did you use an a priori coding based on theoretical framework or other, or more inductive? Was it like grounded theoretical approach?
Okay, I gotta read it. I'm sorry.
Sure,
Visual.
here you go.
Thanks for sharing. Coded your research materials. What does a priori mean?
Like, did you have something up front, or did you derive it from the
Okay, based on theory. Chantal, killing me with this complicated. I'll talk to you later. Oh yeah, so it was a inductive approach. Yeah, it's hard to do. Yeah, like I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, at the middle, whenever I did the illusion, is you got to let your data speak to you. And so I really tried to read and reread and become very familiar with my data so that it can tell me the results. And yeah, I mean, I'm a human being, so it's really hard to refrain from inferring what these things might, or interpreting what these things might mean. But that's the conclusion section where I'm at. So
next question. I'm wondering if the researchers who weren't professors worked within or outside academia. Perhaps your findings have a policy implication beyond academia.
Within or outside?
Yeah.
Or...
So were your researchers working within or outside of academia, basically?
Yes, so there's a table that I presented earlier on who weren't professors. Yeah, so a lot of people actually weren't professors. A lot of them were just plain researchers. Maybe they want to be professors, but pursuing a postdoc. But a lot of them were like working at a digital humanities organization or heritage cultural organization. So I think, and I was surprised. I thought scholars, I almost to the point where I don't even know if I'm going to continue using scholars, because doesn't scholar kind of mean academia? So that I've been kind of interchanging it with the word researcher, because I think that you can do complex thinking research and digital humanities research outside academia. And I think that's what is amazing about digital humanities, is you can be a maker and just do stuff and contribute to the field. So the policy implications beyond academia, I mean, hopefully everybody at SSHRC will read my thesis and take notes, because honestly, like, really, that's the way to do it. Does Chantal have a follow-up question?
No, she's just thanking you.
Okay.
I was
thanks.
studying qualitative coding as part of a course, so I was interested to hear of it from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks.
Are there any questions from folks in the live audience, or the in-person audience, I should say? Brian.
So you're talking about the reuse of data, and that means that someone or a group created the data in the first place. And I wonder if the researchers who you talked to who are reusing data talked about the frustrations they have using somebody else's data, and whether it affected how they may have come to the data set and a particular set of questions in mind, but they had to change their questions because of the way the data had been created. And did they talk about that? And did they talk about that being a problem?
Great question. I think I mentioned it earlier when I said that, you know, that researchers would come up with like this creative, faint idea of like, yeah, I want to research that, and go on the internet. And what's the internet going to tell me about whether I can actually feasibly research this? Yeah, there was a lot of like, I'm not touching that, you know, back out slowly. It's too messy. Yeah, I think what you're asking, if correct me if I'm wrong too, is like almost the availability of the data changes their research line of questioning or their path. And I think it does, it really does affect it. So if we can, and this is just future thinking and stuff, like if we can find a way to make data more findable with metadata schemas and curation, I think that there are answers to all the research questions out there through data, but it's the organization of it that is a mess. So I think one of the biggest things right now is, yeah, cleaning up the internet.
I think, could I just bounce off for a second here? I think the other piece to what Brian's asking is, once you've found that data, you might have imagined certain questions through it, but you realize that something is missing that allows you to take that next step. So there's the kind of frustration of like, oh, I found the data set now. You know, there is this IMDb data set of all the films created in France in a certain period, but then you go to do the work and you realize, oh, that critical lens that I really needed to be able to do it is missing. So that kind of frustration, was that coming through as well? Like, you have the data, but you can't work with it the way you envision. So it changes your focus entirely.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't really get brought up that much, but I think it's like a pivot, right? It's like, yeah, I'm gonna take a step back and figure out how, but then again, researchers are really good at kind of like, how can I wield, you know, the unwieldy data set, how can I wield it to my will? Like, how can I make it somehow answer what I want to know? And how can I pose that question differently? I think they're very creative, right? Researchers, and I don't know.
Evan, I feel like I saw your hand up.
Okay.
Related to that, I thought it was interesting. It said that the scholars who researchers interviewed tended to give up quite quickly if they couldn't find the existing data set.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why you think that was.
Well,
Terribly sorry to interrupt. Could we repeat that question for those that are online? We barely heard that. The first question we barely heard, but we were able to read the captions. But if you
Sure.
could just repeat it for us online, that'd be super swell.
yeah, say it again.
I was just saying that I thought it was interesting that the scholars that Lina interviewed seemed to give up quite quickly if they could find the existing data sets, rather than doing a more comprehensive search or consulting a librarian.
Evan is a librarian. Give up quite quickly is like kind of, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have put it that way, but I mean, it's kind of just, it's a pivot, it's iterative. It's just like searching for any information you adjust, right? You search a little bit, you see what's out there, you see what terms are being used, and you adjust. And I think also, if they give up quite quickly, I mean, it's the exploratory phase of their research, right? So they're looking for a new project. It's that sort of, I'm going to apply for my new funding. These are the things I know about, what I'm known for, my niche of expertise, and like, these are my interests. And so it's kind of like going shopping, and seeing what's out there. And yeah, do you want to spend the time wrangling that data? And I think that was the quick backing out part, is when they saw something that was really dirty, messy, unorganized, incomplete, especially, they would just say, not for me.
Do you want me to read them out loud for you?
Sure.
Okay. So this is from our friend Connie Crompton. This was fabulous. I can't wait for the final publication. The variety of types of data was very interesting. Would you say that there were typical types of qualitative and quantitative data, or were they pretty mixed?
Were there typical types? No, there was no, it was mixed. It was always mixed. No, not one scholar said, I only use qualitative, or I only used quantitative.
And then she follows up later with, if I may ask another, did the participants speak of reusing their own data?
Yeah, so my second interview, which was with an American late career scholar, he 100% can't wait to reuse his own data. So, which is really interesting, because he's making sure that it's clean and organized, because he wants to use it later. And yeah.
And our last virtual question, do you find qualitative data becomes more or less legible with the final digital practice?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by the digital practice.
That's a great question.
It is a good question. I just, maybe my brain's.
Maybe like a digitization of an original manuscript from.
Yeah, with the digital, yeah, okay, so, well, there's many ways to approach that. Or does the person mean my qualitative data, like my interview transcripts? I don't know. If you want to explain a little bit more what you mean.
Yeah, feel free to follow up in the Q&A with a little bit more detail. Are there any other in-person questions? Okay.
I kind of have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Should I come out or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll make this an exercise process as well.
get your steps in.
Yeah, I noticed how you mentioned Library of Congress as one of the common places, and you didn't mention Library and Archives. And I'm sure everyone here, has there been any sort of concerted pressure from academia?
Oh my God,
Am I speaking?
you're after my own heart.
Yeah, to increase accessibility for LAC. And, I don't know,
And
by
to
and large.
and to increase like just knowledge of that being a place where you can get data.
Okay.
Yeah. So I used to work at Library and Archives
you.
Canada for, yeah, we need to talk after this. Yeah, okay, so full disclosure, during my interviews, sometimes I did some ad-libbing. I mean, it's a semi-structured interview, so I think I'm allowed to do that. But often when they would talk about where they would find data to reuse, with the Americans especially, I was always surprised that they didn't say like StatsCan is chock full of good data sets to use and reuse and to look at and to create data viz from, right? And so I was like, do you not have that equivalent? You know, would it be Library of Congress? And I guess it kind of is, but as I understand it, the infrastructure is different in the States for that, in that way. So yeah, I often would kind of come up with my own sort of counter to that and say, like, here in Canada, this is, you know, often, these are places we often look to for data sets, but, the library is a very like in-person kind of place to be, to do research. Not everything is digitized, and it will take many years and a lot of money to do that. And so I think that's kind of the negative downside to what we have in Canada. And that's another thing with the British Library too, right? So if you're in person, you can take photos of the archival material that you wish to study or digitize and digitize it yourself in person. But if you're not in Ottawa, or if you're not in Washington at the Library of Congress, or if you're not in, British Library, near the British Library, it's going to cost you money to get scans of everything you need, and it's going to cost you a fortune. So I think there's something very interesting there. Like, we have to increase accessibility to data for researchers across geographic barriers.
We have a follow-up, and this will be our final question. In general, qualitative data is more difficult to analyze in a way that lets unique data groups be fully legible. I was wondering if you found that with the digital humanities lens, unique trends in qualitative data become obfuscated or more recognizable.
Using all the big words and stuff. Unique trends in qualitative becoming obfuscated, unrecognizable, more recognizable. I mean, some of the sort of unique things that I've seen in my interviews with these 12 scholars is that it goes back to the data types. So I had one person who is looking at the handwritten diaries of an English poet. And so there's a lot of interpretation that you need to do for that. And so, yeah, like that's another, like, it's like another sort of level of complicatedness, I think, when it comes to digital humanities, is the data types. Yeah, and also, employing the services of optical character recognition services, that costs money. So that muddies the water. I don't know. I hope I answered your question. I'm not very good at live stuff, I have to admit, but I did my best. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you so much, Lina. Really happy to have ended the semester highlighting student work, but also highlighting a very important topic for the field. Thank you for joining us in person. Thank you for joining us virtually. And so this was the last of the term, and we'll be back end of January, and we're moving to a new day. So we'll be on Tuesdays at the same time, same place. So virtual, in person, but Tuesdays from 11:30 to 1. And we hope to see you next semester. Have a good holiday break, everybody.
Thank you.